Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. So today we're going to continue with the Peter Brown book, The Love You Make, and find out anything that we haven't heard before or that we may have forgotten about. So once more, the books that I'm going over may not have the total truth in them. We're just going to have to learn what they said and then determine whether or not it's true. And the funny thing is that Peter Brown wrote in his book that the Beatles gave their approval, and then you great viewers let it be known that Paul wasn't happy with the book, and nor were the other band members. So let's see how they handled fame. The Beatles didn't like being under a magnifying glass, but they would like to read the newspapers and see what was being written about them. Paul really got into it. John didn't handle the fame easily, and Paul and George liked the attention. Well, George did early on, I should say, and Ringo was a little bewildered. John was a rebel, and now he was the great intellect. What had gotten him into trouble when he was younger now became wit. So before John and Cynthia moved out of the city, there would be fans who discovered where they lived, and whenever Cynthia wanted to walk Julian, there were girls out front waiting for him. They tried to pinch Julian's cheek and touch him under his chin, and if Cynthia refused to let them touch him or to sign autographs, the girls would spit and curse at her. Sometimes the crowd was so big she didn't go out at all. They also knew John's phone number and would call there, and there were male and female callers. Some were pranks and others were obscene, and some were menacing. There were also letters, and they would say that they could entertain John with sexual tricks. Brian also became famous. The youth looked up to him because of his discovery of the Beatles. At the time, he seemed like he could do no wrong. He had Cilla Black as an artist to manage, and she was doing well, and he also managed Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas. He wrote a book, The Cellar Full of Noise, as we know from a previous video, and the book was a bestseller in Great Britain. Paul's love life came back to haunt him a few times during this time. The first was in Hamburg, where a club owner said that Paul had gotten his daughter pregnant. Paul had encouraged the girl to have an abortion, but Erica refused, and she had a daughter named Bettina the day Paul left Hamburg. Legal documents were drawn up there and delivered to Liverpool. The lawyer David Jacobs got the paperwork, and he advised Paul to deny any responsibility. Jacobs sent the paperwork back without it being answered. He felt that it was a matter for the Hamburg courts, and he felt that their courts moved slower on cases. The lawsuit didn't go away, and the girl's family threatened to bring the case to Great Britain. In 1966, Paul allegedly paid a settlement of $27,000 to keep Bettina's baby a secret. In 1981, Bettina Hubers started to pursue the case again, suing Paul for $6 million. Bettina was forced to drop her paternity suit when she was 46 because it had passed the statute of limitations. Paul said he did a paternity test in 1983, and it said that he wasn't the father. But Bettina stated that he used a body double, and that's why the test turned out negative. But this wasn't the only case for Paul. In Liverpool, a young girl named Alice Doyle gave birth to a baby boy, and she said it was Paul's son. Paul denied being the father, and Jacobs had the girl go to a man named D.H. Green. Alice went with her mother, and Green said that they were both decent and reasonable. She didn't want to hurt Paul, and her only concern was to get a stroller for the baby. So Jacobs was working on a small settlement when Miss Doyle, the mother, told her brother, and he wanted to make sure his niece was properly compensated. They asked for £5,000, and he said they would keep quiet about it then. Jacobs told Brian and Paul that if they paid that amount, there was no way they could be sure the uncle would keep quiet, or that he would demand more. He thought they should pay a small amount and hoped the family would keep quiet. So Jacob drew up 3 deeds of our agreement. The uncle would get £5, signing a vow of silence. The girl's mother would get that amount with the same stipulation. Alice Doyle would get £3,000, with Paul insisting the sum didn't mean what she said was true. If a court case came about and the court ruled in favor of Alice, the maximum payment the court could order for maintenance and education of the child was £2.10 a week until he was 25. Alice getting £3,000 was never to make a claim against Paul in the future or allege that he was the father or disclose the terms of the agreement. Otherwise, she would lose the £3,000. The uncle, though, had no intention of being quiet. He was passing out handbills on the night of Liverpool's Hard Day's Night movie. It stated that Paul was the father and Jacobs promised to bring the uncle to court on blackmail charges. 3 years later, the uncle was still circulating poems about the child to the newspapers. By this time, though, all kinds of people were making allegations, so this one wasn't taken seriously by the newspapers. Paternity suits kept pouring in on Paul. Whether the claims were true were anyone's guess. Brian tried to settle merchandise problem. He hired a lawyer and paid him $50,000 out of his own pocket. Brian said that the cell tab deal was his fault, and he didn't want the Beatles to pay any further for his mistakes. It would take the lawyer 2 years to untangle the seal tab web and vacate the judgment against NIMS. And when it was settled in the summer of 1967, it was only $10,000, which was paid to Nicky Byrne. The Beatles started all over with their own merchandising company called Maximus Enterprises, of which they owned 90%. By then, the Beatles and Brian had lost $100 million. So John was unhappy, but probably not in love with Cynthia, and he was bringing up a child, and his house in the country had turned into a headache. A designer had torn up the house to redecorate it, and John and Cynthia had to live in a small servant's apartment at the top of the house. There was no privacy, with plumbers and electricians there morning and night. Cynthia's mother moved into a small bungalow a few miles away, and she was bossy and opinionated and always around. John didn't want Julian raised by a nanny, and they did have a housekeeper named Dot. Later they got a married couple who became a cook and handyman, but they didn't work out, so they were fired, as well as a chauffeur. John's father, Freddie, was working at a hotel a few miles from where John lived. He was a dishwasher. Freddie may not have found out if it hadn't been for a washerwoman who worked with him at the hotel. Freddie then appeared on John's doorstep. John and Freddie had about a 20-minute talk, and during that short amount of time, Freddie managed to object to John's lifestyle, his music, and the way his home was decorated. He asked John for a loan, and then Freddie was asked to leave. So that didn't stop Freddie from turning up at John's door again, but the door was slammed in his face. Freddie then went to a newspaper and became an overnight media star. He granted interviews about his son for a few quid. He sold his life story to a magazine called Titbits for £40, and he released a novelty single, That's My Life. After he had his teeth capped, which the record company insisted on, it cost him more to pay for the dentist than he earned for his recording career. After that, Freddie went back into obscurity. Ringo settles down. In the winter of 1965, Ringo became the last Beatle to settle down. Ringo had simple tastes, and he liked eggs and chips for dinner. He didn't like to experiment. Ringo was seeing others, but Maureen wasn't going to give up on Richie. Ringo got an infected tonsils on the 1st of December of 1964, and he had to have them removed. Maureen took a long train ride and brought him ice cream, and she was there when he recovered and spent Christmas with him in London. Maureen became pregnant in January, and Ringo did what he was supposed to do. He married her. And on the morning of 3 a.m., he was drunk, and he got down on one knee and proposed to her while his friends were teasing him good-naturedly. They had a quiet ceremony and married February the 11th. Now, during the Help movie, the director thought the boys were acting silly, and he found out they were stoned on marijuana throughout most of the shoot. In 1965, Peter Brown was asked to move to London to deal with John, Paul, George, and Ringo. He supervised their personal lives and business affairs for 5 years. He helped get them out of jail, marry, and divorce them. He had a red phone, and they had a phone number, and it was only for them to use. Nims had a bunch of acts, and Brian had hired many acts, and then he handed them over to assistants, leaving the acts feeling abandoned by Brian. Brian realized the acts were mediocre compared to the Beatles, and one by one they fell to the wayside. He lost Billy J. Kramer, Jerry and the Pacemakers, the Big Three, and Tommy quickly. The one he didn't give up on was Cilla Black. She had limited professional success because she did cover versions of songs. Brian still felt she would be a star. The main reason he hung on to her was because he loved her. She was safe, she was funny and dependent, and she was happily in love with her boyfriend, a blonde Irishman named Bobby Willis. And Brian liked him too. As busy as Brian was with Nims, he decided to open a car dealership called Brydor Auto in Hounslow, Middlesex. Brian and the Beatles had spent a lot of money getting expensive autos, so Brian thought if he owned a dealership, he and the Beatles could get exotic cars at wholesale prices. And he thought other rock stars would go to his dealership because he owned it. Brian was right. It was successful. Brian had his Liverpool friend Terry Doran to run the dealership for him, and he had sold autos in Liverpool. And Brian bought a silver Bentley convertible and a black Mini Cooper, and he already had a red Rolls Royce. Ringo bought 2 Minis, a Land Rover, and a Facel Vega. George Harrison drove a E-Jaguar and a white Maserati like James Bond. He got tired of it when it reached 4,000 miles and gave it back to Terry Doran to sell. John got his driver's license and bought a green Ferrari and a Mini Minor. He returned the Ferrari with only 1,000 miles on it. Brian couldn't rest on his laurels and decided to lease the Seville Theater. Brian was to run a theater, and he wanted to give young playwrights a chance, and he wanted to get the best of rock music. Brian's plays seemed to be flops, but the rock shows sold out. The rock shows, though, couldn't deal with the offset costs of the play's productions. Brian had signed a deal that had the running and rental costs so high that he could never see a profit. So the Seville Theater was there for 3 years, and it was one of the most important places to be seen by the swinging London set. With all the success and fame, it still didn't bring Brian happiness. He felt disappointed. And even his love for John had turned into a fatherly one, like how he felt about the other Beatles. When the night came, Brian was left alone to face himself, so he started taking amphetamine pills and drink. He would read at night because he suffered from insomnia, just like Queenie, his mother. A doctor in London prescribed him barbiturates, Seconal. 1 or 2 of them, and he would be out till dawn, and when he awoke he felt groggy and unhappy late in the afternoon. The doctor didn't know he was taking amphetamines, and when he found out, he told Brian to stop using the pills because they were a threat to his health. Brian said he wouldn't do it, but he did. He started to take more and more because his tolerance to them increased. Some nights he went to the Claremont Club in Berkeley Square. Brian would pass the night playing baccarat, and he drank vintage brandy, smoked a cigar, and took his pills to keep him not too high and not too low. Doing that didn't help him when he gambled, and he lost an average of 5,000 pounds a week, but it went as high as 17,000 pounds in a night. He kept what he lost a secret, but Peter said it was certain that he lost several 100,000 pounds. To compensate for his loss and to keep the gambling going, he would draw heavily on his NIMS personal account, and the staff accountants became concerned after a few months, so he had to find a less notable source of income. He began to call the car dealership. Brian called Terry and asked if any cars had been sold, and if there was a lot of money, he would drive there and get a check or cash. Brian's brother would make trips to see about the accounting books, and Doran loyally never mentioned the tens of thousands of pounds that Brian had drawn and deleted from the books. In 1965, Brian met and fell in love with an American boy living in London named Diz Gillespie. He was in his early 20s, and he wanted to be an actor. Brian signed him as a NIMS artist and gave him a new wardrobe. He paid his debts and gave him a small allowance from his own pocket. Brian's friends tried to warn him about Diz, but Brian felt he was different and special. Diz and Brian spent many evenings at Brian's Wadham House flat. They had large amounts of uppers, Tournals, and cognac. They ended up in the evening in confrontation. One night Diz got into a rage and Brian told him to get out of the house. Diz ran into the kitchen and got a large knife and held it up to Brian's jugular before getting more money out of Brian's wallet. Brian stopped seeing him after that, but he was still pining away for Diz. One day Queenie and Harry went to see Brian because he sounded so depressed. He was hung over and he told them about Diz. Queenie said he should take a holiday in the south of France to forget about him. When Brian and Peter returned, Brian sold his Wadham flat and got a brick Georgian house at 24 Chapel Street. It was a 5-story building, had a private garage, small servants' quarters, formal dining room, and a roof garden. He redecorated with the advice of the designer Kenneth Partridge, and it helped him to forget Diz. So I will end the video here. Fame had its perks, but it also was a cause for troubles, as John, Paul, and Brian found out. I hope everybody enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. I wish everyone a good day and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.